In this video, I want to give an introduction to critical race psychology. The purpose is not to be a comprehensive overview or summary of what critical race psychology has done or what it is capable of doing. Instead, it's supposed to be a baby introduction to people who probably have never even heard of critical race theory, or if they have, they don't know a whole lot about it. The reason I'm doing this video is because I've checked on YouTube and there are no other videos about critical race psychology, and my students tend to prefer watching videos to reading summaries when it comes to studying for a topic or preparing for a class discussion. So this is for them. This is what I would be doing in the classroom, but I'm giving it to them to explore outside of class, so I don't have to be the one talking in a discussion on critical race psychology. I also have the perspective of a white male American talking about critical race psychology, and my perspective is the one that characterizes the majority of content in the history of psychology. So in other words, were you to pick up a psychology textbook and flip to a random page, chances are the study discussed in the paragraph you're looking at was published by a white man who was probably living in the United States at the time of publication. In other words, I have a very privileged perspective that's been done over and over and over and over again. So one of the leads in the critical race psychology pile is recognizing that, okay, yeah, we've heard from the white guys, perhaps there's another perspective that the white guy can't have, they can't take by virtue of their perspective, that's still important, or that is useful, or that is capable of transforming the way we understand psychology today. So I'm kind of at a loss, and you'll see me stutter and kind of fumble my way through this because I represent the perspective that's been overrepresented. And so let that be a big disclaimer to this entire lecture, and I will repeatedly smack myself in the head thinking like, okay, like I'm going to try to not embarrass myself talking about this. So when I talk about race and racism and a white perspective and black perspective, even that right there, it's very kind of confusing and uncomfortable because I'm the last person who needs to be talking about this. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and admit all of that out front. My experience with critical race psychology is very limited. I was invited to write a chapter for a book on critical psychology. I looked at perception. The chapter's available. You can read it online, I'm sure. So I've looked at this a little bit, but by no means do I consider myself an expert. There are some articles and books that have been written about it, and I highly recommend you take a look if it's something that you're interested in. So first, what is critical race theory? So critical race theory has been developing really since the Civil Rights Movement, and so this is when all of the laws in the United States and in some cases abroad that kept persons of color, or specifically persons of African ancestry, separate from people of European ancestry. So the racial laws, the Jim Crow laws in the United States, when those were repealed, but by like desegregating schools, for example, and desegregating churches and hospitals and restaurants and buses, there's still kind of race is still an issue. In other words, there's still racism that's implicit in the structures that we all rely on. So critical race theory asks of every institution, in what ways does this institution reinforce racial differences and racism and bigotry and prejudice and so forth. It's not saying that everything is racist. It's saying in what ways have we overlooked important differences or introduced differences that aren't really even there. And so that we talk about race and racism is kind of evidence that, okay, there are cultural differences, and perhaps those cultural differences are important to consider, even if they shouldn't be used to make decisions about employment, how much someone can pay, where they should live, and so forth. That you have the conversation is the important part, that you start looking at it in a humble sort of way, in a way that says, perhaps I don't know everything on this topic, perhaps there's something more for me to learn. That is the important starting point in critical race theory. In psychology specifically, it's looking at In what ways does psychological science, psychological research, psychological counseling reinforce historical racial prejudices? In other words, how does the practice of science reinforce the idea that people of white or European ancestry are preferable or better or somehow more evolved than people of African or black ancestry? So that idea, that fundamentally racist ideology, how does psychology reinforce that? So it's not saying that psychology is inherently racist. It's saying that, okay, perhaps there are areas where psychology could improve to become more global, to become less, what would it be, nationally centric. I think ethnocentric might be the word for that. Ethnocentric, not be American. So for example, the idea that the American Psychiatric Association writes the manual for mental disorders that's used by more countries in the world than any other manual. The World Health Organization has their own classification of diseases, the ICD-10, which includes psychological disorders, but the American Psychiatric Association, published by the American Psychiatric Association in the United States, is the most widely used manual for making diagnoses. Do you think that's as relevant for people who are living in India or East Asia or Australia as a manual that's published by people living in India or East Asia or Australia? And the answer, of course, is no. They have different histories. They have different stories. They have different religions in some cases. And so all of those regionally specific contexts are important for understanding what psychological disorders, what form they take, how they should be treated, and so on. And to assume that the Americans have it all sorted out is nationalistic conceit at a pretty high order. So that's just one example. Another example, if I'm going to pick on American institutions of psychology and psychiatry, is the American Psychological Association, who in their style guide, the guide that says how to format your papers in APA format, there are 3 pages in there talking about how to be delicate with your language when discussing race or racial topics or ethnicities or nationalities and so on. They talk about how to speak about people of color, people of Asian ancestry, and so forth. But there's nothing in there about a European ancestry. There's nothing about white race. There isn't when you're speaking about a dude with white skin, make sure you use like this language. It's not included at all. And so while it might seem pedantic to draw attention to this, why are you drawing attention to something that's not even there? Well, why isn't it there? Why, when we talk about race, do we exclude people with white skin? When we think about racial diversity, we tend to think of non-white diversity. So for example, if there's a classroom full of black students, like I have at HBCU that I teach at, it's not a racially diverse classroom, but according to like the standard definitions of racial diversity, it's people of non-white ethnicity, or non-white ethnicity. The white group, people with white skin, aren't included in that discussion at all. What does that say about people with white skin, in other words? And what you'll tend to hear in those conversations are that those people don't count in terms of racial diversity, that they are neutral. How come they get to be neutral? That's the question. That's the question asked by critical race theorists. That's the question asked by critical race psychologists. So in critical race psychology, the point is to look at the institutions of psychology. Things like what do you think of when you think of psychology? Mental disorders? Well, those are defined by Americans who are predominantly white. How about counseling methods? Also endorsed by the American Psychiatric Association, which is predominantly white. How about perception, memory, human development, learning? These are the topics that we explore in psychology. The way that we define those scientifically in American psychological circles, which tend to be the most dominant circles in discourse, and if we're going to talk about dominant discourses, United States, Central Europe, perhaps the United Kingdom. Like, those are the dominant discourses, and those are predominantly white. So when we talk about the science of psychology, as it has been developed by predominantly white people. So when we look at it that way, we take that perspective, we say, okay, so this is the science of psychology, but there's a disclaimer, there's an asterisk, and that asterisk is it's a limited perspective. So critical race psychology says, what if there is a different perspective? I like the story. Actually, one of my mentors at University of West Georgia likes the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. This, if you've seen the movie 300, where the angry Spartans kick people into wells and so on, that's when the Persians tried to take over Greece. But the way that they had to enter Greece was around this crooked cliffside. And even though the Persians brought this enormous army that could just destroy the Spartans, the ground they battled on was so narrow that these 300, as the story goes, Spartans were able to fight them off. If they had fought on a battlefield, like Persians would have steamrolled the Greeks or the Spartans and just taken over all of Greece, and then we would have a very different European culture. We would have the Middle Eastern religions, Middle Eastern mysticism would be in place of the Greek historical way of thinking, which is like Aristotelian logic. So science would look very different if the Battle of Thermopylae had gone differently. So that's one event in world history that, had it gone a different way, psychology perhaps would never have developed, or it would have had a different name, or maybe it would still be called psychology, which is the study of the soul, and it wouldn't become the study of the brain as it has in the contemporary Western discourses, which again are predominantly white. Okay, so what if we were to bracket, or what would happen if we were to bracket all of psychology that we understand, published in textbooks, and say, that's one way of understanding it. Bracket it, set it aside. It's no longer the way to understand it, it's a way. What if it were different? And what would it mean for those different perspectives to be given just as much credence or importance as what we call like the natural scientific method, which again was developed by people who had perspectives, and the perspectives were privileged perspectives. In other words, it supported them. It was self-supported. That they weren't developing perspectives that undermined their own authority, if that makes sense. So when we think about something like counseling, one person talking with another person for the purposes of freeing the mind, freeing the soul, opening up ways of being, of restoring spirituality, whatever you call that. What if there wasn't the scientific way that we know, the types of psychotherapeutic modalities that work, which, by the way, evidence isn't very good about any of these therapeutic modalities. But what if we were to go to a country that had never heard of psychology the way we talk about it today? Would they not have methods of restoring being to one another? So if somebody has been down, they've lost a loved one, and they're mourning that, would they see that as a problem? First of all, in the United States, yeah, we do. We got rid of the grieving clause in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. If your mother passes away and you're very close to her and you weep and like you're broken up about that for weeks, it's considered that you have a psychological disorder, that you're depressed, and you can be given medication for that. That's the way we look at it here. Can you imagine a country that has never heard of, or like a indigenous people group who's never heard of psychology, that would say, it's ridiculous. We consider it normal that somebody mourns the passing of a loved one that they were close to. But that kind of disclaimer on the way of seeing psychology and saying, could there be another way? That's one direction that critical race psychology could go. And in some respects, even in the United States, there's pushback with the one psychology. So one thing my students tell me a lot, specifically in counseling courses, or when we're talking about psychotherapy or mental health disorders, the Black community, and again I teach at HBCU, the Black community is by and large skeptical of psychiatric care or psychotherapeutic care. There's this idea pervasive in the Black community that mental health is a personal thing. You don't share, it's private. You don't share that outside of the family. and you deal with it with the family, with the church. You don't share it publicly. And so there's some distrust of going to see therapists, going to see a psychiatrist, or getting some sort of consultation. And that's not to be an indictment against that people group. I'm not trying to be critical of that. What if instead of saying, oftentimes my students who have been trained in this ethnocentric way of looking at psychology, they'll say, I wish my community took mental health more seriously. That's a very ethnocentric way of looking at it. What if the tables were turned and the skepticism of psychiatric care was considered the standard, and that believing that you could go talk to somebody and feel better about your life was the marginalized one? That's the one who don't take psychiatric care seriously. It could just as easily be the case. And so when we look at psychology from a critical race psychology lens, what we do is dethrone the common discourses, or the discourses that receive the most privilege. I apologize if you can see that in the video. There's like something going on with the color. A couple of other things that critical race psychology looks at. A tendency, particularly in the United States, to atomize racism. So atomizing racism means, yes, racism is a problem, but we can break it down into individual events. And so if we can just get rid of all those individual events, then racism is no longer a problem. So for example, when I moved to Georgia, it was the first time I'd ever heard the N-word, which is a pejorative word used to talk about people of African descent or black skin color. And so it's used in a hurtful, hateful kind of way. When I hear it, I'm appalled because I was surprised that it was even used. I'd only ever read it sort of in books. I never actually heard it spoken. But the word is used in everyday parlance here, but it makes people very uncomfortable. There are a lot of stories of college professors who have been fired for using it in the classroom, even if they were using it for scholarly purposes or to give an example. So for example, there was a professor, I think at Emory, in a law school, who was reading from an actual court proceeding, something that a prosecuting lawyer had said to the defendant, and it was supposed to demonstrate like this racial tension, and then he got fired for using it, even though he was reading from the protocol. So anyway, it makes people very uncomfortable, and so, and it's a racially motivated, racially prejudicial motivated word. So it's meant to be hurtful generally. But what it represents is these racial prejudices. The belief is that if we can get rid of the word, then we get rid of the prejudices. But in fact, people that use the word are simply demonstrating their prejudice. People who don't use the word are hiding their prejudice. And so it's like, does that really get rid of the problem? Like if no one ever uses that hurtful word, yeah, we don't have to hear it anymore. But what it's doing is demonstrating something that's already there. And so critical race psychology doesn't stop at getting rid of the atomic or the separate instances of racism. So like if people of color were no longer targeted by police officers, for example, would we get rid of racism? Well, no, that's just the way that it kind of comes forward. That's the way that it's demonstrated. It's still, those actions represent like a deep-seated implicit racism. And so critical race psychology examines the implicit racism. And one of the ways that that's come up has been in people's perceptual observations that are racially charged. So they don't even feel like they're making a racially motivated perception or decision, when in fact, like, you can control variables to demonstrate that skin color is actually informing the way that you perceive other people. And there are tons of studies about that. And so like even though someone's not trying to be racist or trying to affirm racial ideologies, they're still doing so. Another thing that critical race psychology looks at is this idea that I don't see race. So like, oh, I look at everyone the exact same. I don't see race. Well, on the one hand, that practice might reinforce this idea that I'm not going to interpret you based on your skin color. But on the other hand, it kind of hides or camouflages what people of color have had to overcome to get where they are. So for example, if I have a classroom of 20 students, 10 are black, 10 are white, and they all turn in like identical essays, and I say like, oh, I'm not going to take skin color into consideration, I'm going to look at them all the same, without recognizing that my 10 black students have had to overcome what research shows is tremendous adversity. The fact that they haven't wound up in prison puts them at somewhat of a minority because of the way that schools target students of color with discipline, and that those students are 3 times more likely to wind up in prison. I'm making up that statistic. I think it may be 5 or 6 times more likely. But I can, if you email me, I can give you the studies that I'm referring to. So the idea of not seeing race, while it sounds good on the one hand, it also hides or camouflages racial differences, or at least the racism that's there. It overlooks the adversity that people have had to overcome, the racial prejudices that they've had to overcome. And so I think I've introduced all of the topics that I wanted to in terms of critical race psychology. This story is just getting started, by the way. It's this area of scholarship and discourse that's just opening up. And so how would you take this this beginning and like forge a path forward? Well, you would begin by looking at some area of psychology that you're interested in, such as I've given the example already of clinical psychology or psychological disorders, treatment, perception. You could look at memory or learning. Are the ways that we teach about learning and the methods for teaching the best methods for everybody? Because again, if you look at where the trials have been conducted, they tend to be at major universities, and major universities tend to be in areas that are not ethnically diverse, right? They're homogenous, and the homogeneity is in a particular direction that you can probably predict. So when we say that this is the way that students learn, what we mean is this is the way that white students learn, or students from white upper middle class social groups. And so it's really not the way that people learn best. How would we do this? How would we change that narrative or look at a counter narrative? Well, we would use different participant groups. We would be more intentional with our sampling strategies. We may even take something that's common right now in counter or cross-cultural psychology is to look at a finding that's been popular in the United States and then move it to a different country and like reproduce the experiment and see if the same findings are there. Do students still learn the same way in Malaysia, for example? Or what if we were to take the same experiment to Malaysia and then say, let's redesign this study in a way that makes the most sense to the Malaysian people? How would they design the study? And the study would probably not be an experiment, or maybe it would, if they've taken into the experimental method popularized by positivistic science and natural sciences. But maybe it would be something different, but we would allow them to kind of direct that path. When we look at methodologies or ways of collecting data and analyzing the data, qualitative methods tend to be the most popular with things like critical race psychology because they decenter the researcher. So in experimentation, the researcher has to control everything. They're the center. Like if they design it perfectly, then the data are worthwhile. If they were to do it incorrectly, or if they were to step out of center, then the study would fall apart. Whereas with qualitative research, the researcher is open to alternative explanations. What they're doing is actually listening to their participants and being changed by them. So it's a lot more dynamic. So qualitative research, because it's less structured, allows for a greater diversity of perspectives. And so they tend to be more common. But that doesn't mean that you can't conduct a critical race psychology experiment. It would just have to examine and possibly break up the standard discourses in the discipline. So don't follow behind like you're holding the train of psychological science. Let it go and try to design something new using an experiment to do so, possibly. All right, well, I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll have in class and any questions that you want to post below.